Today, we're stepping quietly into a world most people think they understand, the Middle Ages, a time we imagine as dark, dirty, and forgotten. But what if the truth is far more surprising? What if medieval life wasn't just mud and castles, but a delicate daily dance between survival and dignity, between smoke-filled rooms and scented herbs, between crowded streets and carefully washed linen? Close your eyes for a moment and picture it, the soft crackle of a hearth fire, cool water poured into a wooden basin at dawn, sunlight filtering through a narrow window, the scent of rosemary scattered across the floor. In a world without plumbing, without electricity, without modern medicine, how did people stay clean? How did they fight smell, sickness, and decay using only what nature gave them? Tonight, we're not rushing. We're walking slowly through stone streets, listening to distant church bells, feeling the rhythm of medieval life unfold around us. And as the candles flicker and the centuries soften, you might discover that this world wasn't as filthy as legend says. And perhaps, in some quiet ways, it wasn't so different from ours. The more the myths fade, and the real medieval world begins to breathe. When we imagine hygiene in medieval times, we often picture a world of constant filth, unbearable smells, and people who rarely, if ever, washed. While there is some truth to the idea that sanitation was limited compared to modern standards, the reality was far more complex and varied across regions, social classes, religions, and centuries. Medieval hygiene was shaped by local resources, climate, medical beliefs, religion, and urban development, and it evolved significantly between the early Middle Ages and the later medieval period. In many parts of Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, large public bathhouses and advanced sewage systems fell into disrepair. Roman cities had once boasted aqueducts, public latrines, and complex drainage systems. But maintaining such infrastructure required centralized administration and resources that fragmented kingdoms often lacked. As a result, some urban sanitation systems deteriorated, and daily life became more localized and rural. However, this did not mean that people abandoned cleanliness altogether. In fact, many medieval people valued washing, grooming, and personal care, even if their methods differed from ours. In early medieval villages, most people lived in small wooden houses with dirt floors and limited ventilation. Domestic animals were often kept close to living quarters, sometimes even inside during winter. This proximity contributed to odours and parasites, but it also provided warmth and protection. Water had to be fetched from wells, rivers, or communal fountains, which meant that frequent full-body bathing was labour intensive. Instead of daily baths, people commonly washed their hands and faces each morning using basins and pitchers. Combs were widely used to remove lice, and archaeologists have discovered finely crafted bone and wooden combs in many medieval settlements, suggesting that hair care and delousing were routine practices. Soap existed, typically made from animal fat and wood ash, though it was not as refined as modern soap. In some regions, especially around the Mediterranean, soap making became an established craft, and scented varieties were produced. Public bathing culture did not entirely disappear after Rome. In many medieval towns across Europe, Bathhouses operated throughout the High Middle Ages. These establishments offered hot water baths, steam rooms, and sometimes even food and entertainment. Bathing was often a social activity, with men and women sometimes bathing together in certain periods, though regulations varied. However, attitudes toward bathing changed over time, particularly after the outbreaks of the Black Death in the 14th century. Medical theory at the time was influenced by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, and later scholars like Galen, who promoted the concept of balancing bodily humours. Many physicians believed that hot baths opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. When plague devastated Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing a significant portion of the population, some people blamed bathhouses for spreading illness. As fear grew, public bathing declined in certain regions, not necessarily because people rejected cleanliness, but because they feared contaminated water and shared spaces. In contrast, the medieval Islamic world maintained a strong bathing tradition. Cities such as Baghdad and Cordoba were known for their sophisticated urban infrastructure, including public baths called hammams. Cleanliness was deeply connected to religious practice in Islam, which requires ritual washing before prayers. As a result, bathing facilities remained widespread and socially important. In Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, cities reportedly had hundreds of bathhouses, and visitors from northern Europe often remarked on their cleanliness. Similarly, in parts of the Byzantine Empire centered around Constantinople, Roman bathing traditions continued in modified forms. Even within medieval Europe, hygiene varied by class. Nobles and wealthy merchants had greater access to water, servants, and bathing facilities. Castles and manor houses often included private chambers with wooden tubs. While hauling and heating water required effort, the upper classes did bathe, particularly before important social events. Clean linen was highly valued, and changing undergarments was considered a sign of refinement. Linen shirts absorbed sweat and could be washed more easily than wool outer garments, which were harder to clean. Perfumes and scented herbs were commonly used to mask odors. People carried small bundles of fragrant plants or wore pomanders, small containers filled with aromatic substances, believing they protected against foul air and disease. Dental hygiene was rudimentary, but not entirely neglected. Toothpicks were common, and some people rubbed their teeth with cloth and abrasive powders made from charcoal, salt, or crushed herbs. Medieval diets varied significantly by region and class, but many peasants consumed coarse bread and fewer refined sugars than later generations, which may have somewhat limited cavities, though tooth decay and gum disease were still widespread. Barbers performed multiple roles in towns and cities. The medieval barber was not just a hair cutter, but also a practitioner of minor medical procedures, such as bloodletting, tooth extraction, and wound treatment. The red and white-striped barber pole is said to symbolize blood and bandages from these practices. Urban sanitation presented particular challenges. Medieval towns grew rapidly from the 12th century onward, often without careful planning. Narrow streets were lined with houses, whose upper stories sometimes leaned over the road. Waste disposal was inconsistent. Chamber pots were emptied into cesspits, or unfortunately, sometimes thrown into the streets. Larger cities created regulations to manage waste. appointing officials to oversee cleanliness, and imposing fines for dumping refuse in public spaces. In places like London and Paris, municipal governments issued ordinances requiring residents to maintain clean frontages and clear gutters. Nonetheless, heavy rains were often relied upon to wash away accumulated filth. Rivers served as both water sources and dumping grounds, leading to contamination. Monasteries, guided by religious rules, sometimes maintained higher standards of cleanliness. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized order and discipline, and many monasteries had latrine blocks built over running water to carry waste away. Monks washed their hands before meals and observed structured daily routines that included personal grooming. In some convents and monasteries, bathhouses were attached to the complex, though bathing frequency varied by rule and climate. Religious views on cleanliness were nuanced. On one hand, spiritual purity was considered more important than physical appearance. On the other hand, biblical teachings encouraged washing as part of ritual and hospitality. Clothing played a crucial role in medieval hygiene. Most people owned limited garments, but even peasants typically had at least one change of linen. Washing clothes required large amounts of water and labour, often done communally near rivers. Lye soap and wooden paddles were used to beat garments clean. Because wool outerwear was not washed frequently, it could harbour odours and parasites. Fleas and lice were persistent problems across social classes. People used fine-toothed combs, herbal treatments, and even small heated metal tools to combat infestations. Bed straw was replaced periodically, and mattresses were aired out when possible. Seasonal factors strongly influenced bathing habits. In colder climates, full immersion baths were less common in winter due to the effort needed to heat water and the risk of illness from cold exposure. Instead, sponge baths were more practical. In warmer Mediterranean regions, bathing was easier and more frequent. Climate and geography therefore shaped daily routines as much as culture did. Trade networks also affected hygiene. The revival of long-distance trade in the High Middle Ages brought spices, perfumes, and soap-making techniques from the Eastern Mediterranean into European markets. Medical understanding of disease was limited by the absence of germ theory. People attributed illness to imbalanced humours, miasma, bad air, or divine punishment. Because they did not know about bacteria, some hygienic practices were inconsistent. For example, physicians might recommend avoiding bathing during epidemics, while simultaneously advising hand washing or herbal fumigation. Despite misconceptions, medieval people were not indifferent to dirt or smell. Complaints about stench appear frequently in legal records and literature, indicating awareness of sanitation issues. Town councils invested in wells, conduits, and sometimes rudimentary sewer channels to improve conditions. Over time, especially toward the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, urban infrastructure slowly improved. Guilds regulated trades, including tanners and butchers, whose work generated strong odours and waste. These trades were often moved to the outskirts of towns. Street paving projects reduced mud and stagnant water. Though far from modern sanitation standards, these measures demonstrate ongoing efforts to address public health challenges. In summary, medieval hygiene was neither uniformly filthy nor uniformly clean. It was shaped by tradition, religion, environment, social status, and medical theory. The collapse of Roman infrastructure did lead to setbacks in some regions, but practices of washing, grooming, and sanitation persisted and adapted. Public bathhouses thrived in certain periods and places, especially in Islamic cities and parts of southern Europe, while fear of disease sometimes curtailed communal bathing in northern Europe. Urban overcrowding and limited sewage systems created genuine health. As we continue to deepen this picture, it becomes clear that medieval hygiene was fundamentally shaped by effort, memory, and inherited habit. Cleanliness was not governed by written manuals for most people, but by tradition. What parents had taught, what neighbors practiced, what had proven useful in keeping discomfort manageable. The absence of modern plumbing did not mean the absence of systems. It meant systems were manual, repetitive, and dependent on human labor rather than engineering networks. In most households, cleaning was a daily rhythm rather than an occasional event. Floors were swept in the morning to remove ash from the hearth, and dirt brought in from outside. Food scraps were gathered quickly to prevent attracting rodents. Water left from washing vegetables or hands might be reused for cleaning surfaces before being discarded. Nothing was wasted casually. The cycle of use, reuse, and disposal was continuous and deliberate. Rodents posed a serious hygiene challenge. Grain storage attracted mice and rats, and these animals could spread disease and contaminate food supplies. Cats were valued not just as companions, but as pest controllers. Keeping food elevated and sealed was essential. While medieval people did not know about bacteria carried by rodents, they understood that rodent infestation correlated with spoilage and sickness. The medieval perception of the body was different from modern culture's obsession with constant bathing. Skin was seen as a protective barrier. Excessive washing, especially in hot water, was believed by some physicians to weaken this barrier by opening pores. Therefore, moderate washing, especially of visible areas, was considered healthier than constant immersion. Sponge baths, wiping with damp cloths, and washing hands frequently were practical compromises between cleanliness and medical caution. The rhythm of the church calendar influenced hygiene habits. Before major feast days, households often made greater efforts to clean living spaces and clothing. Attending church in soiled garments would have been socially embarrassing. Thus, spiritual preparation and physical preparation were intertwined. Clean clothes signaled respect not only for community but for sacred space. Marriage contracts and dowries sometimes included linen inventories, reflecting how highly valued clean fabric was. A bride bringing multiple sets of sheets and garments into a household improved not just wealth but hygienic stability. Linen was central to bodily cleanliness because it could be washed far more effectively than wool. In wealthier urban households, bathing equipment became more elaborate by the late medieval period. Wooden tubs lined with cloth, privacy screens, and scented additives enhanced the experience. Bathing was sometimes followed by rubbing the skin with oils or herbal preparations. Though still not daily for most, bathing was neither rare nor shocking. Medical practitioners also advised specific hygienic behaviors for particular conditions. Those suffering from skin ailments might be told to bathe in mineral, rich waters if available. Certain towns known for springs developed reputations for therapeutic bathing. While scientific explanations were limited, Experiential knowledge about soothing waters circulated through word of mouth. The medieval countryside, often imagined as untouched and pure, had its own sanitation realities. Animal waste was abundant, but integrated into agriculture as fertilizer. The open landscape allowed greater dispersal of waste than crowded towns. Rivers served multiple purposes: drinking water upstream, washing and disposal downstream. Communities informally learned to separate these functions to some degree. The idea of airing out spaces was deeply embedded in daily life. Doors and shutters were opened whenever weather allowed. Bedding was hung outside in sunlight. Sunlight was associated with renewal and health. Though germ theory was centuries away, exposure to light and air did reduce dampness and mold, indirectly improving conditions. Travelers often described foreign cities in terms of cleanliness or filth, revealing that standards were relative. A merchant from a well-managed Italian city might consider a northern town dirty, while a villager might view a crowded port as overwhelming. These subjective impressions remind us that hygiene varied widely across regions. The development of more structured public health responses in the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly in response to plague outbreaks, marks a turning point. Quarantine systems, isolation hospitals, and regulated burial practices emerged. While not fully effective, these measures show that hygiene was moving from purely domestic practice into civic responsibility. Even so, medieval hygiene remained vulnerable to crisis. War disrupted waste removal, famine weakened immune systems, floods contaminated wells when stability faltered, sanitation deteriorated quickly. This fragility highlights how much medieval hygiene depended on constant human effort. Yet in stable times, the system functioned. People washed what they could, when they could. They replaced rushes on floors. They laundered linen at riversides. They combed lice from hair. They scraped mud from boots. They regulated waste imperfectly but intentionally. They burned herbs for fragrance and fumigation. They sought comfort within limitation. The medieval world was not sterile, but it was not indifferent. Cleanliness was practical, symbolic, and communal. It required labor, cooperation, and repetition. Without mechanical assistance, every act of hygiene involved muscle, time, and awareness. In the final analysis, medieval hygiene was a testament to human adaptability. Living without modern sanitation technology, medieval people still developed routines that preserved dignity and relative order. Their efforts may appear insufficient by modern standards, but they were shaped by the knowledge and tools available within stone walls and wooden cottages, beside rivers and within market squares. Medieval communities continuously negotiated the boundary between body and environment, imperfectly, persistently, and purposefully. If we continue extending this exploration to its fullest depth, one of the most revealing truths about medieval hygiene is that it was not a static condition, but a constant negotiation between control and inevitability. People understood that complete cleanliness was impossible in a world without running water, enclosed sewage, chemical disinfectants, or germ theory. What they pursued instead was stability, reducing discomfort, limiting visible dirt, and maintaining social acceptability. In many homes, the hearth was the center of daily life, and it shaped hygiene patterns in complex ways. The fire provided warmth, light, and the ability to heat water for washing. At the same time, it filled interiors with soot and smoke particles that settled on walls, clothing, and hair. This meant that cleaning was never a one-time achievement. Ash had to be swept daily. Chimneys gradually improved ventilation, but in earlier centuries, smoke simply escaped through roof gaps or small openings. People became accustomed to smoky environments, yet they still wiped surfaces and refreshed interiors when possible. The medieval relationship with mud deserves particular attention. Roads were rarely paved outside major cities. Rain transformed pathways into thick sludge, especially where animals and carts travelled frequently. Boots became caked with dirt. Many homes had a transitional space near the entrance where footwear was removed or scraped. In urban centres, paving slowly expanded in commercial districts, reducing some of the worst accumulation. Yet mud remained a constant companion, particularly in rural regions. Seasonal cycles dictated hygiene more strongly than any written rule. In spring, after months of confinement and limited washing during cold weather, households often undertook extensive cleaning. Bedding was aired. Floors were scrubbed. Walls might be whitewashed. This was not merely practical, it marked renewal. Summer allowed more frequent bathing in rivers or heated tubs. Autumn harvest brought new mess from food processing, grain dust, fruit pulp, vegetable waste, requiring renewed cleaning effort. Winter limited water availability and made full bathing less practical, increasing reliance on sponge washing and linen changes. The concept of linen as second skin was central because linen absorbs sweat and oils. Replacing or washing it effectively refreshed the body even if the outer layers remained worn. This explains why linen was so highly valued in household inventories. A household with multiple linen garments had greater hygienic resilience. Even among modest families, at least one spare set was often maintained for church or special occasions. Smell remained one of the most important sensory markers of hygiene. Medieval people were deeply attuned to odour. Pleasant smells symbolised health and moral order. Foul smells suggested decay or imbalance. Herbal bundles were placed under pillows, in clothing chests, and among rushes on floors. Rosemary, lavender, mint, and thyme were common. These practices were not simply cosmetic. They were rooted in the belief that scent influenced health. Urban authorities gradually recognized that waste accumulation threatened not only comfort but commerce. Merchants relied on reputation. A filthy market could deter customers. Therefore, cities increasingly regulated slaughterhouses, tanning pits and dye workshops. These industries were often relocated near rivers downstream from drinking sources. Though imperfect, such spatial planning represented evolving environmental awareness. The medieval understanding of disease transmission was incomplete, yet observation shaped behaviour. As we continue extending this picture, it becomes important to understand that medieval hygiene was shaped by repetition and endurance, rather than transformation. There was no sudden clean revolution within the Middle Ages itself. Instead, habits accumulated slowly across generations. Knowledge about what worked, even if imperfectly, was passed orally within families and communities. A mother taught her children how to rinse hands before meals, how to shake out bedding at sunrise, how to scrub pots with ash, how to hang linen where wind could reach it. These practices were not written in scientific manuals, but embedded in daily routine. One of the most telling aspects of medieval hygiene is how much effort went into maintaining textiles. Clothing represented both wealth and protection, so preserving it was essential. Stains were treated carefully. Mud was allowed to dry before brushing it away. Grease spots were worked with lye or scraped gently. Because fabric production was time-consuming and expensive, garments were patched rather than discarded. This careful maintenance had hygienic value. Keeping clothing intact and relatively clean reduced irritation, insect attraction, and odor buildup. The body itself was viewed as something that required balance. Excessive dirt was undesirable, but excessive washing was also sometimes discouraged under humoral theory. Physicians influenced by classical authorities believed that too much bathing could weaken the body by opening pores and disturbing internal equilibrium. Therefore, hygiene was practiced with moderation. Warm baths might be prescribed for specific ailments, such as joint stiffness, but not necessarily as a daily routine. Cold water rinsing was common, especially in warmer seasons. Medieval cities developed recognizable sanitation patterns. Waste was often collected in pits behind houses. When full, these cesspits were emptied and transported outside the city. Though unpleasant, this was organized labor, not random neglect. In some places, night workers were responsible for removing waste discreetly. Their existence demonstrates that urban centers acknowledged the need for systematic disposal. Street life also influenced hygiene perception. Markets, festivals, and religious processions brought crowds together. Before such gatherings, streets were often swept and debris cleared. Cleanliness was associated with civic pride. When rulers or important visitors entered a city, authorities made special efforts to improve appearance, clearing refuse, spreading fresh rushes, decorating public spaces. Hygiene in these contexts was tied to honor and reputation. Smell remained a central guide. Aromatic plants were hung indoors, placed beneath bedding, or scattered across floors. Rosewater and other distilled scents were used among elites. Even poorer households relied on locally available herbs. While these did not eliminate bacteria, they created psychological relief and a sense of order. In a world where livestock and smoke were constant, the presence of pleasant fragrance symbolized care. Water storage technology gradually improved. Barrels collected rainwater from rooftops. Stone cisterns stored supplies for dry seasons. Though stagnant water could itself become contaminated, covered storage reduced debris intrusion. In some regions, small-scale aqueducts or wooden pipe systems channeled water from hills into town centers. These innovations, though limited in reach, reveal ongoing experimentation with infrastructure. The hygiene of tools and utensils was equally important. Shared eating practices meant that spoons, knives, and cups circulated among diners. These items were rinsed and wiped between meals. Wooden dishes were scraped clean, ceramic vessels were washed. Ash, sand, and vinegar functioned as cleansing agents. While these did not sterilize surfaces by modern standards, they removed visible residue and reduced spoilage. Childhood education included lessons in modesty and grooming. Hair was combed, faces wiped, and garments straightened before leaving the house. In social settings, appearing disordered could invite ridicule. Literature from the period occasionally mocks characters who neglect personal grooming, indicating that hygiene norms were culturally reinforced. During times of plague recurrence in the 15th century, cities increasingly experimented with health boards and isolation protocols. Though still guided by incomplete theories, officials began recording cases, restricting movement, and enforcing cleaning of public areas. These responses mark a transitional phase toward more formalized public health systems. In rural areas, environmental cycles played a role. Spring thaw washed away accumulated winter debris. Summer sun dried dampness. Autumn harvest generated waste from food processing, requiring cleanup. Winter constrained water use, but also slowed decay. Hygiene was thus tied to nature's tempo. Even bathing frequency must be understood within context. Medieval people did bathe, just not daily in the modern sense. Bathing might occur monthly, seasonally, or for special occasions. Partial washing filled the gaps. In warmer climates or near rivers, immersion was easier. In colder regions, sponge bathing and steam rooms were more practical. Cleanliness was therefore not absent. It was adapted. The contrast between myth and reality is significant. Popular imagination often portrays the medieval world as universally filthy and indifferent to sanitation. In truth, medieval societies invested labor into cleanliness, regulated waste imperfectly but intentionally, and valued personal grooming. They lacked microscopes, sewage treatment plants, and chemical disinfectants, yet they recognized that unmanaged dirt led to discomfort and illness. Ultimately, medieval hygiene was a lived system, manual, sensory, communal, and adaptive. It operated through habit rather than theory, through effort rather than efficiency. It reflected a world closer to earth and animal life, more exposed to climate and decay, yet still striving for dignity. The medieval individual existed in an environment where cleanliness required constant physical action, and through that repeated action, washing, sweeping, airing, laundering, combing, people maintained a workable balance between body and world, even in the absence of modern science. As we continue extending this exploration, one of the most important things to understand about medieval hygiene is that it functioned within a completely different relationship between humans and their environment. Modern life is built around separation. Sewer pipes carry waste far away. Water flows instantly from taps. Trash disappears into managed systems. In the medieval world, separation was limited. Waste water, animals, smoke, and people existed in much closer proximity. Hygiene, therefore, was about managing closeness rather than eliminating it. In most towns and villages, people lived in intimate contact with soil, animals, and seasonal change. Dirt entered homes on boots, hooves, and wheels daily. Floors were swept constantly. Door thresholds often had raised beams or simple scraping tools to reduce the amount of mud tracked inside. While this did not create sterile interiors, it demonstrates awareness and repeated action. Cleanliness was maintained through persistence rather than infrastructure. Food storage reveals another layer of medieval hygienic thinking. Grains were kept in dry bins elevated from the ground to prevent dampness and pests. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried to slow decay. Cheese and bread were stored carefully to avoid mold growth beyond acceptable levels. While spoilage still occurred, preservation methods were rooted in observation of what delayed rot. Managing decay was a central hygienic challenge in a pre-refrigeration world. In larger urban homes, servants were assigned specific cleaning tasks. Chambers were aired daily, fireplaces were cleared of ash, bed linens were shaken out, windows were opened when weather allowed. Even though smoke and soot were unavoidable, active maintenance reduced build-up. Wealthier families could afford multiple sets of bedding and garments, allowing rotation that improved freshness. The psychological comfort of washing should not be underestimated. Medieval texts occasionally describe the refreshment of bathing after travel or illness. Bathing before a wedding, feast, or religious event symbolized renewal. In that sense, hygiene was emotional as well as physical. It restored confidence and social readiness. Rural river bathing, especially during warmer months, likely occurred more often than surviving records suggest. Written documents tend to focus on urban elites, but common people had access to streams and lakes. Children especially would have swum or splashed during summer. Cold winters, however, sharply limited immersion bathing in northern regions. This seasonal contrast meant that the experience of cleanliness varied dramatically throughout the year. Another often overlooked aspect is dental hygiene. Though primitive compared to modern dentistry, people used toothpicks made of wood or bone. Some rubbed teeth with cloth and abrasive powders, such as salt or crushed charcoal. Sugar consumption was lower for most of the population than in later centuries, which may have somewhat reduced cavities, though tooth decay was still common. Dental pain was treated by barbers or surgeons, who could extract damaged teeth. The management of bodily waste inside homes required ingenuity. Chamber pots were commonly used at night. These were emptied into cesspits or designated disposal areas. Though the popular image of waste being carelessly thrown from windows is exaggerated, such incidents did occur. More often there were informal norms about where waste could be discarded. Over time, cities attempted to regulate these practices more strictly. As we push even further into the fabric of medieval daily life, it becomes clear that hygiene was deeply connected to rhythm of daylight, of labor, of seasons, of religious observance, and of communal life. Cleanliness was not defined by a single standard, but by context. What was considered properly maintained in a farming hamlet might differ from expectations in a royal court. Yet both environments had their own internal logic of order and care. Morning routines were structured around water in whatever quantity was practical. A jug placed near the sleeping area allowed for rinsing of eyes and face upon waking. Hands were scrubbed before food preparation. In households with more resources, warm water might be provided for washing, particularly during colder months. Even in modest homes, face washing was associated with wakefulness and readiness. It was tied to the concept of appearing orderly before others. Community wells were important not only for water collection, but for social interaction. Because wells could become contaminated, Some towns established rules about protecting them from waste or animal intrusion. Wells were sometimes covered, and buckets were communal. The cleanliness of these shared water sources was a matter of collective responsibility. Although microbial contamination was not understood, people observed that foul-tasting or murky water often preceded illness. One subtle but important feature of medieval hygiene was the emphasis on airflow. Medieval architecture evolved gradually to improve ventilation. Larger windows appeared in wealthier homes. Shutters could be opened during daylight to allow fresh air to circulate. Air was believed to cleanse, especially when scented. Houses were sometimes positioned to capture prevailing breezes. Stagnant air was associated with disease under miasma theory, so moving air was valued. In urban centres, public fountains gradually supplemented wells. These fountains, often supplied by gravity, fed systems from nearby springs, provided cleaner water than rivers running through populated areas. The maintenance of these fountains became a civic priority in some towns, reinforcing the idea that water quality was linked to communal well-being. Laundry was one of the most labour-intensive aspects of hygiene. Washing days involved soaking garments in lye solutions made from wood ash, then beating them against stones or wooden boards to remove dirt. Clothes were laid out on grass or hung over hedges to dry. Sunlight itself was believed to purify fabrics. Because washing was physically demanding, it occurred periodically rather than daily, but it was not neglected. Even peasants took pride in freshly laundered linen, especially for church attendance or social gatherings. Shoes and footwear also affected hygiene. Many people wore leather shoes that became caked with mud. Before entering homes, boots were scraped or left near doorways. Floors were swept to prevent dirt from accumulating indoors. In wealthier houses, servants handled much of this cleaning in poorer households. It was shared family labour. The medieval diet influenced hygiene in indirect ways. Meals consisted largely of grains, vegetables, and preserved meats. Food preparation areas needed cleaning to prevent spoilage. Leftovers could attract pests, so scraps were disposed of quickly, often fed to animals. Kitchens, though smoky and dark, were maintained with routine sweeping and scrubbing. Cooking vessels were cleaned using ash or sand, effective abrasives that removed residue without modern detergents. Hair washing was less frequent than today, but not absent. Soap made from animal fat and alkaline ash was used in some regions. Herbal rinses were common, because hair absorbed smoke and sweat. Regular combing was essential. Hair coverings, especially for women, helped protect hair from environmental dirt and were also markers of modesty and marital status. In religious spaces, hygiene carried symbolic weight. Before receiving communion, believers often washed hands. Clergy maintained vestments carefully, laundering and repairing them as part of ritual discipline. Monasteries, structured by strict daily schedules, often demonstrated higher levels of environmental order than crowded urban neighborhoods. Latrines built over running water and designated washing areas illustrate thoughtful planning within monastic communities. Urban growth in the later Middle Ages forced cities to confront sanitation more directly. As populations rose, so did waste. Some municipalities introduced early systems for organized refuse collection. Workers were hired to remove accumulated waste from cesspits and transport it outside city limits. Although these systems were inconsistent, they represent deliberate public health efforts rather than indifference. During times of epidemic, fear intensified hygiene measures. Households cleaned more vigorously, burned herbs indoors, and avoided crowded bathhouses. Authorities sometimes closed marketplaces or restricted gatherings. Isolation of the sick became more structured over time. Though ineffective against plague bacteria in modern understanding, these responses reveal growing recognition that proximity influenced illness. In rural villages, open space allowed somewhat easier waste disposal than in cities. Manure was collected for agricultural use, integrating sanitation into farming cycles. Rivers provided seasonal bathing opportunities. However, droughts or harsh winters reduced water availability, limiting washing frequency. Clothing storage and maintenance reveal another layer of medieval hygiene. Garments were stored in chests, often with herbs or aromatic woods, to deter insects. Seasonal clothing rotation meant heavier garments were stored during warmer months and vice versa. This storage practice reduced wear and allowed cleaning before reuse. Social perception of smell was complex. While strong odors were common in medieval life, excessive body odor could be mocked in literature and satire. Cleanliness signaled social awareness and respect. At court, appearing unwashed could damage reputation. Thus, hygiene intersected with status and honor. Importantly, medieval hygiene was cumulative. It did not rely on a single daily bath, but on consistent small actions: washing hands, combing hair, sweeping floors, airing bedding, laundering linen, replacing rushes, regulating waste. These acts formed a continuous effort to manage environment and body together. By the end of the medieval period, incremental improvements in soap production, textile availability, and municipal governance set the stage for later sanitation revolutions. But even without germ theory, medieval people were not resigned to filth. They lived in closer contact with natural processes, decay, animals, mud, smoke, and responded with adaptation rather than abandonment. In the broadest sense, medieval hygiene reflects resilience. It was shaped by manual labor, communal regulation, religious symbolism, and evolving civic awareness. Though lacking modern plumbing and scientific precision, it was guided by observation, habit, and shared standards of dignity. The medieval world was more physically demanding and less sanitized than ours. Yet within that reality, its people continuously sought to create livable, orderly spaces through the practical tools and knowledge they possessed. As we look even deeper into the final centuries of the medieval period, it becomes increasingly clear that hygiene was tied not only to survival and social expectation, but also to psychology. Cleanliness provided a sense of control in a world where disease, famine, and war were constant threats. Washing one's hands, changing linen, sweeping floors, or airing bedding were small acts of stability. Even when people did not understand invisible pathogens, they understood discomfort, odor, visible grime, and the feeling of refreshment after rinsing skin with cool water. Domestic space was organized with hygiene in mind, even if imperfectly. In many homes, cooking areas were somewhat separated from sleeping spaces to reduce smoke and grease buildup in bedding. Storage chests elevated clothing above damp floors. Hooks or pegs kept garments off the ground. These small architectural and spatial choices reduced contact with dirt and pests. Though medieval houses could be smoky and dark, they were not randomly chaotic. They reflected intentional arrangement shaped by experience. Medieval people also associated certain times of life with increased attention to hygiene. Before marriage ceremonies, both bride and groom often bathed as part of preparation rituals. After illness, a cleansing bath or washing of clothes marked recovery. In some regions, communal bathing before major religious feasts reinforced both spiritual and physical renewal. These moments show that cleanliness was symbolically powerful. It signified transition, purification, and readiness. The relationship between hygiene and class remained pronounced. Nobility had servants to heat water, launder clothing, and maintain chambers. Castles and manor houses often had designated washing rooms or portable tubs brought into private quarters. Even so, full bathing was not necessarily daily. It was scheduled and purposeful. For peasants, bathing was less elaborate but still present, often occurring in rivers during warm months or via sponge baths indoors during winter. Differences lay in frequency and convenience rather than total absence. Urban infrastructure slowly matured in certain regions. Some towns developed rudimentary water conduits that transported spring water downhill into public fountains. Stone paving reduced mud accumulation in central streets. Drainage ditches, though open and imperfect, directed waste away from doorways. Guild regulations increasingly separated food production from heavy industry. As we continue deeper into the everyday realities of medieval hygiene, it becomes even clearer that cleanliness was not ignored. It was simply constrained by technology, infrastructure, and belief systems. Medieval people lived in close proximity to nature in ways modern societies rarely experience. Muddy roads, livestock, open hearth fires, and seasonal flooding were part of daily life. Because of this, hygiene was not about eliminating dirt entirely, but about managing it continuously. In many households, the day began with small but meaningful acts of washing. A ceramic or metal basin stood ready for rinsing hands and face. Towels, often shared among family members, were hung nearby. Combing hair was essential not only for appearance, but also for removing debris and parasites. Fine, toothed combs have been discovered across Europe, from rural villages to major cities, suggesting that delousing was a routine and accepted task. Grooming was part of social respectability. A person who appeared excessively dirty might be judged as lazy or morally careless. Sleeping arrangements had hygienic consequences as well. Many families slept in shared spaces, sometimes in the same bed. In inns, multiple travellers might share bedding. Straw mattresses were common, and although they were periodically replaced, they could harbour insects. People attempted to mitigate this by airing bedding outdoors in sunlight, which they believed refreshed fabrics and removed harmful vapours. Blankets were shaken out regularly, and in wealthier homes, feather beds were turned and fluffed to prevent dampness. Urban density amplified challenges. In tightly packed districts of cities like Prague and Ghent, houses leaned over narrow lanes, limiting airflow and sunlight. Drainage ditches ran along streets, carrying away wastewater and rain. These were often open, creating unpleasant smells but still serving a functional purpose. During heavy rainfall, streets could flood, washing refuse away, but also spreading contamination. Civic authorities sometimes organized communal cleaning days, especially before festivals or visits by royalty. The medieval understanding of disease revolved largely around humoral theory and miasma. According to prevailing belief, imbalance within the body or exposure to corrupted air caused illness. Therefore, ventilation was considered important. Opening shutters, lighting fires to circulate air, and burning aromatic substances were practical responses grounded in this worldview. Although these methods did not eliminate pathogens, they reflect an earnest attempt to control environmental risk. Water access varied dramatically. In some towns, public fountains provided relatively clean spring water. In others, residents depended on rivers that were also used for washing clothes and disposing of waste. Wells were central gathering places, and protecting them from contamination was crucial. Some communities imposed penalties for dumping refuse near water sources. The need to carry water in buckets limited how much could be used daily, reinforcing the practice of partial washing rather than full immersion baths. Clothing was both a shield and a challenge. Layers protected against cold and dirt, but thick fabrics trapped sweat. Linen undergarments absorbed moisture and could be boiled clean, making them essential for maintaining a sense of freshness. Even when outer garments were worn repeatedly, changing linen provided psychological and physical relief. Wealthier households owned multiple sets, while poorer families relied on careful maintenance of fewer garments. In agricultural communities, work dictated hygiene patterns. Farmers labored in fields, tending animals and harvesting crops. Washing after such labor was practical, but often limited to rinsing hands and face. Children played outdoors freely, and their cleanliness was often less strictly monitored than adults. Nevertheless, before attending church or visiting markets, families generally attempted to present themselves tidily. Hospitals in medieval cities were primarily charitable institutions providing shelter for the sick and poor. While sanitation standards were limited, some hospitals emphasized clean bedding and washing of patients. Religious orders overseeing these facilities viewed care of the body as an act of mercy. Though medical treatment was rudimentary, bathing and fresh linen were considered therapeutic. The medieval bathhouse itself deserves closer attention. In earlier centuries, bathhouses were lively social spaces, offering heated water, steam, and sometimes food. Bathing was often communal, and in some regions mixed. Gender bathing occurred before stricter moral codes developed. By the 15th century, in parts of northern Europe, bathhouses declined due to fear of contagion and moral criticism. However, in other regions, especially under Islamic influence, bath culture remained vibrant and structured, emphasizing sequential rooms of varying temperatures and thorough washing rituals. Even the architecture of castles and manor houses reveals hygienic intent. Stone floors could be scrubbed. Windows, though small, allowed airflow. Rainwater was channeled into storage cisterns. Kitchens were often separated from living quarters to reduce smoke and odor. Servants were tasked with sweeping halls, replacing rushes, and maintaining chambers. While the grandeur of castles is often romanticized, their sanitation systems were surprisingly practical within technological limits. Seasonal epidemics exposed the fragility of medieval hygiene systems. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, or plague often spread rapidly in crowded quarters. In response, cities attempted to isolate the sick, restrict gatherings, and increase street cleaning. Though lacking scientific accuracy, these responses demonstrate that communities actively sought solutions. Importantly, medieval hygiene cannot be measured solely against modern standards. The absence of indoor plumbing and modern sewage systems does not mean the absence of hygiene altogether. It means that cleanliness required manual labor, shared responsibility, and adaptation. Every bucket of water carried, every garment beaten clean by the river, every comb passed through hair, and every bundle of herbs placed on a floor represented effort toward maintaining comfort and dignity. By the close of the medieval period, incremental changes in trade, governance, and craftsmanship laid foundations for future sanitation advances. Soap became more refined. Urban planning slowly improved. Awareness of contagion grew, even if poorly understood. Medieval society was neither wholly unsanitary nor hygienically advanced. It existed in a continuous process of managing its environment with the tools and knowledge available. In essence, medieval hygiene was an ongoing negotiation between nature and culture. It involved daily rituals, seasonal rhythms, religious influence, social expectations, and communal regulation. While the world was undeniably harsher and more physically demanding than today, medieval people were not indifferent to cleanliness. They cared about appearance, comfort, health, and social respect. Within the stone walls of cities and the timber frames of cottages, they pursued cleanliness in ways shaped by their time, limited, imperfect, yet persistent and purposeful. If we look even more closely at the lived experience of medieval hygiene, we begin to see that it was less about grand systems and more about thousands of small, repetitive acts woven into daily survival. Cleanliness was not a single event like a modern shower. It was a series of ongoing adjustments, washing what could be washed, airing what could be aired, masking what could not be removed, and repairing what could not be replaced. One of the most overlooked aspects of medieval hygiene is the role of time and labor. In a world without running water, every act of cleaning required physical effort. Water had to be drawn from a well or river, carried home in buckets, heated over a fire, and then disposed of afterward. Firewood itself required gathering or purchase. For a peasant family, this meant that a full body bath was not simply a matter of preference, but a logistical operation. As a result, people prioritized partial washing, hands, face, neck, and feet, because these areas were most exposed and most socially visible. This selective approach to hygiene was practical and intentional. The concept of clean enough was central. Medieval people did not aim for sterility. They aimed for manageability. Mud on boots could be scraped off at the door. Hands could be rinsed before eating. Sweat could be absorbed by linen. Odors could be softened with herbs. This layered system of maintenance created a rhythm of cleanliness that fluctuated with seasons, workload, and social obligations. Before church services, market days, weddings, or festivals, Individuals were more likely to wash thoroughly and wear their best garments in urban houses, particularly those built of timber and plaster. Dust and soot accumulated quickly. Open hearths filled interiors with smoke particles that settled on beams and walls. Households periodically wiped down surfaces and renewed whitewash. Lime-based whitewashing not only brightened rooms, but helped deter insects and reduce surface grime. Floors were swept daily with twig brooms, and rush coverings were replaced when excessively soiled. While rushes sometimes trapped dirt, they also insulated against cold stone floors and could be removed and burned when worn out. The medieval relationship with insects was constant. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were widespread across all social classes. Yet infestation did not automatically signal neglect. It reflected crowded living conditions and limited pest. Control technology, people used fine combs, herbal washes, and even small heated tools to remove lice. Bedding was exposed to sunlight when possible. As the medieval world moved further into the 15th century, daily hygiene continued to be shaped by routine, resourcefulness, and deeply rooted cultural expectations rather than scientific knowledge. People did not wake up in a mindset of neglect. Rather, they operated within a framework where water was labor. Intensive to obtain, heating it required fuel, and medical theories often warned against excess bathing. Even so, morning washing rituals remained common. A basin, pitcher, and towel were standard features in many households, including modest ones. Guests were often offered water to wash their hands upon arrival, a gesture of hospitality and respect that appears frequently in written accounts. Eating practices also reveal much about hygiene standards. Meals were typically communal, with diners sharing trenchers of bread and using their fingers for certain foods. Because of this, washing hands before and after eating was not merely symbolic, it was practical. Etiquette manuals from late medieval courts instructed individuals to keep nails short, avoid spitting across the table, and refrain from placing greasy fingers into shared dishes. Such instructions suggest that cleanliness was valued and consciously regulated, particularly among the upper classes. In growing trade hubs like Antwerp and Lelfebeck, expanding merchant populations increased pressure on urban sanitation. Warehouses, docks, and crowded housing blocks intensified waste management challenges. Municipal authorities sometimes required property owners to pave streets in front of their homes, helping reduce mud and stagnant water. Stone paving made sweeping easier and limited the accumulation of refuse. Although open drains were still common, improvements in street design gradually enhanced urban cleanliness. The management of animals played a significant role in medieval hygiene. Livestock such as pigs, chickens, and goats often roamed freely in towns. While useful for consuming scraps, they also contributed to waste. Over time, some cities passed laws restricting free roaming animals within central districts. Stables were cleaned regularly in wealthier households, and manure was collected for agricultural reuse. The constant presence of animals meant that complete odor control was impossible by modern standards. Yet people developed tolerance thresholds and methods to mitigate excess accumulation. Personal scent management extended beyond herbs scattered on floors. Distillation techniques improved during the later medieval period, influenced partly by knowledge circulating from Islamic scholars such as Avicenna, who advanced methods of extracting plant essences. Perfumed waters made from roses or orange blossoms gained popularity among elites. These were dabbed on skin and clothing, not only for fragrance but also under the belief that pleasant smells protected against harmful air. Illness and quarantine practices gradually became more structured. In Italian states such as Florence and Venice, officials established designated plague hospitals, sometimes located on islands or outside city walls. These institutions attempted to isolate the sick from the healthy, reflecting a growing awareness of contagion even if the mechanism was misunderstood. Streets were sometimes cleaned more thoroughly during outbreaks, and households burned aromatic woods to purify interiors. Household cleaning itself involved more than simple sweeping. Wooden surfaces were scrubbed with sand or abrasive powders. Walls were periodically whitewashed with lime, which brightened interiors and reduced insect presence. Cooking vessels were scoured with ash and water. Though soap was not used as liberally as today, it was applied in laundry and sometimes in personal washing, particularly among those who could afford it. The experience of hygiene in castles deserves particular attention. Contrary to popular imagery of perpetually filthy fortresses, many castles incorporated surprisingly practical sanitation solutions. Stone garderobes projected outward so waste would not accumulate inside living quarters. Rainwater collection systems stored water in cisterns for washing and cooking. Servants maintained chambers, replacing rushes and airing bedding. However, during sieges, conditions deteriorated rapidly, demonstrating how dependent cleanliness was on stability and supply lines. In universities such as University of Paris, students and scholars lived in dense quarters. Complaints about odors, lice, and unclean lodging appear in letters and administrative records. Yet these complaints also indicate expectation. People noticed and criticized poor hygiene rather than accepting it passively. Educational institutions sometimes set standards for dormitory cleanliness, though enforcement varied. Rural monasteries often achieved comparatively better sanitation due to controlled populations and disciplined routines. Running water diverted through cloisters allowed for relatively efficient waste removal. Gardens cultivated medicinal herbs used in cleansing mixtures. The emphasis on order in monastic life extended naturally to physical surroundings. Climatic differences across Europe also shaped hygiene patterns. In Mediterranean regions, outdoor life and warm temperatures made water access easier and bathing more frequent. In northern climates where rivers froze in winter and heating water required significant fuel, sponge bathing was more practical than full immersion. Yet even there, combing hair, trimming nails, and changing linen remained routine. By the end of the medieval period, incremental improvements in trade, architecture, and governance laid groundwork for more substantial sanitation reforms in later centuries. Soap production increased in scale, textile industries expanded, and municipal laws grew more detailed. However, without understanding microorganisms, medieval hygiene remained limited in its ability to prevent epidemic disease fully. Ultimately, medieval hygiene was characterized by effort within constraint. People washed when they could, groomed carefully, regulated waste imperfectly, and responded to outbreaks with the knowledge available to them. Their world was undeniably more pungent and less sanitized than ours, yet it was not devoid of standards or care. Cleanliness carried social meaning, spiritual symbolism, and practical value. Within stone cities, timber cottages, monasteries, castles, and market squares, medieval men and women navigated daily life with a continuous, if technologically limited, commitment to maintaining bodily and environmental order. As the medieval era approached its transition into the early modern world, attitudes toward hygiene reflected a tension between inherited traditions and emerging anxieties about disease. People were deeply aware of dirt, decay, and bodily discomfort, even if they lacked modern microbiology. Letters, sermons, civic ordinances, and household accounts repeatedly mention washing, airing, scrubbing, and perfuming. These references make clear that medieval society did not passively accept grime. Rather, it negotiated cleanliness within the limits of water supply, fuel availability, architectural design, and prevailing medical theory. In expanding commercial centers such as Hamburg and Valencia, maritime trade intensified concerns about contagion. Ships arriving from distant ports were sometimes suspected of bringing illness along with goods. Local authorities experimented with inspection protocols and temporary isolation. While not based on germ theory, these measures show that people linked crowding and travel with outbreaks. Ports developed designated areas for unloading cargo, and sometimes restricted access to urban centers during suspected epidemics. The sensory world of medieval towns was undeniably strong. The smell of tanned leather, brewing ale, wood smoke, manure, and open drains mixed in narrow streets. Yet people adapted. Windows were opened for ventilation when weather allowed. Perfumed sachets were hung indoors. Church interiors were often filled with incense, not only for liturgical symbolism, but also to create a sense of freshness. During large gatherings, church floors were sometimes strewn with herbs to reduce odor and dust. The connection between scent and health was so deeply rooted that pleasant fragrance itself was considered protective. Hygiene in medieval inns reveals the complexity of travel life. Travelers arriving after long journeys were offered water for washing hands and sometimes feet. Inns provided shared beds or straw pallets. Bedding might not be freshly laundered between guests, increasing the spread of lice and fleas. Nevertheless, innkeepers were expected to maintain a baseline of order. Complaints about unclean accommodations appear in legal records, showing that customers had expectations of cleanliness, even if standards varied. The evolution of textile production had indirect hygienic consequences. As cloth became more accessible through regional trade networks, more households could own additional garments. This allowed for rotation and washing, rather than constant wear of a single set of clothes. Linen production in particular expanded, enabling more frequent changing of undergarments. Fresh linen was widely associated with refinement and bodily cleanliness, even when full body bathing was infrequent. Ritual and symbolism also played roles in maintaining order. Before major festivals such as Easter, families might conduct thorough cleaning of homes, wash garments, and repair furnishings. This seasonal renewal reinforced both spiritual and physical freshness. In agricultural communities, spring cleaning coincided with warmer weather, making outdoor washing and drying more feasible. Rugs, bedding, and mats were taken outside, and beaten to remove dust and insects. In fortified cities like Carcassonne, enclosed walls limited expansion, intensifying sanitation. As the later Middle Ages moved toward the early modern period, hygiene practices continued to shift gradually rather than dramatically, shaped by demographic recovery after the Black Death, expanding commerce, and slow improvements in urban governance. One important development was the increasing role of municipal authorities in regulating cleanliness. In growing cities such as Nuremberg and Milan, town councils issued detailed ordinances concerning street cleaning, slaughterhouse locations, and disposal of animal waste. Inspectors could fine residents who dumped refuse into waterways or blocked drainage channels. Although enforcement was inconsistent, these laws reveal that civic leaders recognized a direct connection between sanitation and public welfare. Markets were central to medieval life, and maintaining their cleanliness was crucial. Fishmongers, butchers, and vegetable sellers were required in some cities to wash their stalls and remove spoiled goods promptly. In coastal areas, fresh fish could quickly rot in summer heat, producing strong odors that attracted insects. Urban records describe efforts to rinse market squares with buckets of water and to sweep them regularly. Wells in public squares were sometimes protected by low walls or covers to reduce contamination from animals and debris. The role of guilds also affected hygiene. Crafts such as tanning, dyeing, and metalworking generated by products that could pollute water or soil. In places like Florence, guild regulations dictated where certain trades could operate, often pushing the most polluting activities downstream or outside city walls. These measures were practical rather than environmental in the modern sense, but they nonetheless shaped urban cleanliness. Tanneries, which required soaking hides in mixtures that included urine and animal dung, were notorious for their stench. Separating such industries from residential districts reduced everyday exposure to foul smells and waste. Clothing maintenance remained a cornerstone of personal hygiene. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and could be boiled or beaten clean, while wool outerwear was brushed and aired. In some regions, fulling mills used water, powered machinery to clean and thicken wool cloth, indirectly improving textile hygiene on a broader scale. Wealthier households sometimes owned multiple sets of garments, allowing rotation and laundering. Clothing chests were scented with dried herbs to repel insects, and cedar wood was valued for its protective properties. Bathing frequency varied widely even within the same city. Some individuals bathed weekly, others monthly, and some only a few times per year. It depended on access to water, cost of heating it, occupation, and prevailing beliefs about health. Physicians trained in universities such as University of Bologna studied ancient texts and debated the health effects of bathing. Medical manuals sometimes recommended warm baths for joint pain or skin conditions, while cautioning against excessive immersion during times of epidemic. Herbal remedies were common: chamomile for soothing skin, sage for cleansing, and vinegar as a disinfectant. Like rinse, though its effectiveness against pathogens was limited. Personal grooming tools discovered in archaeological sites provide vivid insight into everyday habits. Metal mirrors, though less reflective than modern glass mirrors, were used for shaving and hairstyling. tweezers removed stray hairs. Ear scoops and nail cleaners were part of compact grooming sets carried by travellers. The survival of these objects across centuries suggests that individuals invested time and resources in maintaining personal appearance. Public latrines varied in design. In castles, garderobes were small rooms projecting from outer walls, allowing waste to drop into pits or moats below. Though unpleasant, this method kept waste outside main living quarters. In monasteries, latrine blocks were sometimes constructed above running streams, using gravity to carry waste away. In towns, shared privies served clusters of houses. Cesspits required periodic emptying, and the collected waste could be transported for use as fertilizer in agricultural fields outside city walls. This recycling of organic waste demonstrates a practical, if not sanitary, integration between urban and rural economies. Water infrastructure slowly improved in some areas. Wooden pipes and stone conduits carried spring water into certain cities. Public fountains provided access to cleaner water sources than rivers contaminated by upstream activity. In Siena, an underground network of tunnels known as battini supplied water to fountains, reflecting sophisticated medieval engineering. While such systems did not eliminate disease, they improved reliability of supply. Cultural attitudes toward smell were different from modern expectations. In a world of livestock, wood smoke, leather processing and open air markets, strong odors were part of daily sensory experience. Yet unpleasant smells were frequently criticized in literature and satire, indicating that people distinguished between acceptable and offensive scents. Pleasant fragrances symbolized refinement, while foul odors were associated with moral decay or poverty. This symbolic dimension reinforced efforts to mask or reduce smells, even when full sanitation was unattainable. The home interior itself reflected hygienic strategies. Floors in wealthier homes might be covered with rush mats that could be shaken and replaced. Walls were whitewashed periodically. Lime-based whitewash had mild antibacterial properties, though this was not understood scientifically. Windows, often unglazed in poorer dwellings, allowed airflow. Fresh air was widely believed to restore health, leading households to open shutters when weather permitted. Even during plague outbreaks, people burned incense and herbs to clean the air, acting within their understanding of disease causation. Travel posed additional hygiene challenges. Pilgrims journeying to sites such as Santiago de Compostela Cathedral walked long distances under varied weather conditions. Inns provided basins of water for washing hands and faces, but full baths were rare on the road. Travellers carried spare linen and grooming kits. Dusty roads, crowded hostels, and shared sleeping quarters increased exposure to parasites, yet washing rituals before meals and prayer remained part of routine discipline. By the 15th century, gradual demographic recovery and economic expansion supported modest improvements in living standards. Soap production increased, textile trade flourished, and some cities invested more in infrastructure. Still, without knowledge of microbes, outbreaks of typhus, dysentery, and plague persisted. Hygiene was a balance between intention and limitation. People desired cleanliness, but technology and medical understanding constrained what they could achieve. In conclusion, medieval hygiene was neither a myth of universal filth nor a hidden era of pristine living. It was a complex interplay of environment, belief, social hierarchy, and resource availability. From rural cottages to fortified castles, from monasteries to Mediterranean ports, individuals practiced daily washing, grooming, laundering, and waste management, according to the means and knowledge available to them. They valued fresh linen, clean hands before meals, scented herbs, and regulated markets. Though modern plumbing and germ theory were centuries away, medieval societies continually adapted, regulated, and refined their approach to cleanliness within the boundaries of their world. Another important dimension of medieval hygiene was the relationship between cleanliness and identity. Cleanliness signaled discipline, respectability, and sometimes even moral virtue. In courtly culture, appearing well, groomed was essential. A knight preparing for a feast or tournament might bathe, trim his beard, comb his hair, and dress in freshly laundered linen as a display of honour and refinement. Court poetry often linked physical cleanliness with inner nobility, suggesting that outward presentation reflected character. Likewise, noblewomen were praised for smooth skin, neatly arranged hair, and sweet fragrance. Grooming rituals thus had social as well as practical meaning. Religious life shaped hygiene in subtle but consistent ways. Christianity included ritual washing in certain contexts, such as the washing of feet in imitation of Christ's humility. Monastic communities maintained scheduled washing before communal meals, reinforcing the idea that bodily order paralleled spiritual order. Meanwhile, in Jewish communities, ritual immersion in a mikveh, ritual bath, was central to religious practice, ensuring that regular bathing remained integrated into spiritual life. In Islamic societies, ritual ablution before prayer ensured that washing hands, face, and feet occurred multiple times daily. Cities influenced by Islamic governance, including Cordoba and Fez, developed extensive public bath networks that supported both hygiene and religious observance. In colder northern regions such as Scandinavia, archaeological discoveries from Viking age settlements reveal combs, tweezers, and soapstone containers, indicating that even in harsh climates grooming remained important. Norse sagas describe weekly bathing on Saturdays, a practice so distinctive that in some places Saturday became associated with washing. Though heating water required effort, the cultural expectation of periodic bathing persisted. Hair care illustrates the medieval balance between practicality and aesthetics. Long hair, whether male or female, required regular combing to prevent tangling and lice infestation. Lice were common across all classes due to close living quarters and shared bedding, but they were not necessarily seen as a sign of extreme neglect. Hygiene in medieval times was deeply intertwined with daily survival, seasonal rhythms, religious customs, and social identity. And the experience of cleanliness could differ dramatically depending on whether someone lived in a remote northern village, a Mediterranean trading city, or a bustling capital. Even though the grand sewer systems of ancient Rome were no longer widely maintained in Western Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, knowledge of bathing and sanitation did not vanish overnight. In many early medieval communities, practical habits developed around the realities of labour, intensive water collection. People rose at dawn, washed their hands and faces in bowls, combed their hair carefully, and changed linen when available. Clean hands before meals were expected in most households, especially among the nobility. Manuscripts and courtesy books from later centuries reveal instructions reminding individuals to wash before dining, not wipe greasy hands on shared tablecloths, and keep fingernails trimmed. These small details suggest that people were concerned with bodily presentation and social etiquette. Smell played a powerful role in medieval life. In a world without synthetic deodorants, scented herbs such as rosemary, lavender, sage, and thyme were commonly used. Floors of homes were often strewn with rushes mixed with aromatic plants, not only to provide insulation and absorb dirt, but also to create a more pleasant fragrance. Over time, these rushes could accumulate debris, which modern observers sometimes interpret as evidence of extreme filth. Yet many households replaced them periodically, particularly before festivals or important gatherings. Among the wealthy perfumes imported through trade routes from regions influenced by the Abbasid Caliphate were highly prized. Contact with cities like Damascus and Cairo helped spread advanced soap, making techniques and aromatic distillation methods into Europe. In coastal Mediterranean regions, bathing traditions remained stronger. In parts of southern Italy and Spain, bathhouses operated continuously, often influenced by the architectural and cultural legacy of Islamic rule in areas such as Granada and Seville. Travelers from northern Europe sometimes expressed amazement at the relative cleanliness and frequency of bathing they witnessed in these cities. Bathhouses were more than places to wash. They functioned as centers of relaxation, social networking, and even business negotiation. However, over time in parts of Christian Europe, moral suspicion sometimes attached itself to bathhouses, associating them with promiscuity. As outbreaks of plague and other diseases spread, public bathing faced further criticism, particularly after the devastation of the Black Death. Although people did not understand germ theory, they observed that crowded spaces seemed linked to illness, and bathhouses sometimes became casualties of fear. Rural life presented its own hygiene patterns. Peasants who worked in fields daily were exposed to sweat, mud, and livestock waste. Rivers and streams provided opportunities for bathing in warmer months, and children likely swam regularly during summer. During colder months, washing was limited to sponge baths indoors. The physical labor of agricultural life meant that clothing became soiled quickly, but garments were precious and not easily replaced. Washing days were communal events, often involving women gathering at riversides with wooden paddles and homemade soap. The act of laundering itself was physically demanding, requiring soaking, scrubbing, beating, rinsing, and wringing heavy wet fabric. Because linen was more washable than wool, undergarments were key to maintaining a sense of cleanliness. Even when outer garments were worn repeatedly, fresh linen underneath helped absorb sweat and could be changed more often. In growing medieval cities such as Florence and Venice, civic authorities gradually implemented regulations to manage waste. Butchers were required to dispose of animal remains outside city centres, and tanners were often relocated near water sources downstream to reduce stench in residential districts. Cesspits were dug behind houses, and some were cleaned periodically by workers whose job it was to remove accumulated waste. These workers, sometimes called gong farmers in England, laboured at night to empty latrines and transport waste beyond city walls. Though unpleasant, This occupation indicates organized attempts at sanitation, rather than total neglect. Water quality posed ongoing challenges. Wells could become contaminated, especially in densely populated districts. Boiling water for cooking and brewing ale or beer often made beverages safer to drink than untreated water. Contrary to a common myth, medieval people did drink water, but alcoholic beverages were also widely consumed, partly because the brewing process killed many harmful organisms. Wine was common in southern regions, while ale was more prevalent in northern Europe. These drinks were not necessarily strong by modern standards, but formed part of daily nutrition. Medical theory shaped attitudes toward bathing and bodily care, influenced by ancient authorities such as Galen. Medieval physicians believed health depended on balancing four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Bathing could be prescribed to restore balance, but it was also thought to open pores, making the body susceptible to harmful air. During plague outbreaks, many people avoided full immersion baths, choosing instead to wash selectively or fumigate rooms with incense and aromatic woods. The idea of miasma, poisonous air, led to widespread use of scented items. Wealthy individuals carried pomanders filled with ambergris, cloves, or musk, believing pleasant smells repelled disease. Hair and beard care were significant aspects of male hygiene. Beards were fashionable in some periods and shaved in others. Barbershops served as social hubs where men discussed politics, trade, and news. Barbers trimmed hair, shaved faces, and sometimes treated minor wounds. Women maintained long hair carefully, braiding and covering it with veils or head coverings. Head coverings not only signaled modesty or marital status, but also helped protect hair from dirt and lice. Infestations were common enough that dowsing combs appear frequently in archaeological finds. Personal grooming tools, tweezers, ear scoops, nail cleaners, have been discovered in medieval graves, suggesting that attention to detail in personal care was widespread. Child hygiene depended heavily on family resources. Infants were swaddled tightly, and cloth wrappings were changed when soiled. Mothers and caregivers bathed infants when possible, though frequent washing in winter may have been limited. Childhood mortality was high, often due to infectious diseases that spread rapidly in crowded environments. Yet communities developed rituals around cleanliness and care, including washing before baptism and cleansing after illness. Seasonal festivals often included special cleaning rituals. Before major religious celebrations like Easter or Christmas, households might undertake more thorough cleaning of homes and clothing. Churches themselves were cleaned and decorated. Pilgrimage culture also intersected with hygiene. Travellers walking long distances to shrines, such as Canterbury Cathedral, would endure weeks on the road, often with limited access to washing facilities. Upon arrival in towns, they might seek bathhouses or inns offering basins for washing. Climate, trade, and politics all influenced hygiene standards. In northern climates with harsh winters, bathing frequency naturally decreased during cold months. In warmer regions under Islamic rule, regular bathing remained deeply integrated into daily religious life. Cultural exchanges during the Crusades exposed Europeans to Eastern bathing customs, spices, and medical knowledge, gradually reshaping European habits over centuries. It is important to understand that medieval hygiene cannot be measured solely by modern expectations. People did not possess microscopes or knowledge of bacteria, yet they recognized the importance of washing hands before meals, maintaining clean clothing, and managing waste. Odors were criticized in literature, and city councils debated sanitation laws. Even in poorer districts, individuals tried to maintain dignity through grooming and laundering when possible. While the absence of modern plumbing, disinfectants, and antibiotics meant that disease spread more easily, medieval society was not indifferent to cleanliness. By the late medieval period, gradual improvements in urban planning, trade networks, and craftsmanship contributed to better hygiene practices in many regions. Soap production became more sophisticated, textile industries expanded, and municipal governance grew more structured. Though far removed from contemporary sanitation systems, the medieval world reveals a nuanced picture of adaptation, resilience, and practical effort in the face of limited scientific understanding. Cleanliness was shaped by belief, necessity, and environment. And while conditions could certainly be harsh and unpleasant, medieval people lived within a framework of habits and customs that aimed in their own ways to preserve health, comfort, and social respectability. As medieval centuries progressed, hygiene continued to evolve in subtle but meaningful ways, shaped not only by local custom, but by shifting economic power, religious reform movements, warfare, and technological change. In many parts of Europe between the 11th and 13th centuries, population growth and urban revival led to increasingly complex town life. Expanding trade networks connected ports such as Genoa and Barcelona to North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. They recognized that filth could breed discomfort and illness,